They say that the way you treat others has a way of coming back to you. Whether you call it karma, fate, or something far more sinister, countless people believe that every choice eventually carries a consequence. Sometimes those consequences arrive almost immediately. Other times, they wait patiently for years. This is the story of a young man whose life fell apart after making a decision he thought he'd never have to answer for. Just days before his wedding, Victor walked away from the woman who loved him. 3 years later, without any warning, he began experiencing terrifying episodes that no doctor could explain. Some believed it was a severe panic disorder. Others insisted it was something much darker. Victor had no idea that his nightmare had actually begun long before the first attack. At 24 years old, his life seemed almost perfect. He had graduated from college with honors, landed an impressive job at a bank, and climbed the corporate ladder faster than anyone expected. His coworkers respected him for his professionalism, his discipline, and the simple fact that he was never late. Everything about his life followed the same predictable routine. Every morning he woke up before sunrise, exercised, grabbed a quick breakfast, and headed downstairs to his car. The drive to work took less than half an hour. It was an ordinary Tuesday. Until his car refused to start, Victor frowned and turned the key again. Nothing. A third attempt. Still nothing. The vehicle was practically brand new. It had never broken down before, and there had never been an accident or mechanical issue. Annoyed but not overly concerned, he decided to catch a ride with someone passing by. After standing on the sidewalk for nearly 15 minutes without any luck, he gave up and walked toward the nearest tram stop. As the tram rolled through the city, Victor found himself thinking about his university days. Back then, he and his friends rode public transportation almost every day because they couldn't afford anything else. For a brief moment, the memory made him smile. Then everything changed. Without warning, it felt as if all the air had been sucked out of his lungs. His chest tightened. His heartbeat exploded. An icy sensation spread through his entire body, locking every muscle in place. Deep inside, a feeling unlike anything he had ever experienced began to grow. Pure terror. There was no reason for it. Nothing had happened. And yet every instinct in his body screamed that he was in terrible danger. He looked around at the other passengers. Only moments earlier they had seemed like ordinary commuters. Now, every face looked disturbing. Every stranger felt threatening. It was as if the people surrounding him had transformed into something unfamiliar. Victor suddenly wanted to disappear, to hide, to become invisible. The fear kept growing until he could no longer control himself. Without realizing what he was doing, he screamed and buried his face in his hands. Just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. Silence filled the tram. The passengers stared at him. Some looked frightened. Others looked genuinely concerned. Victor couldn't explain what had just happened. At first, he convinced himself it had been a strange one-time episode. He was wrong. Only a few days later, another attack struck while he was sitting at his desk during work. This time it was even worse. The overwhelming terror returned without warning, completely shutting down his ability to think. When it finally passed, Victor slowly realized he was sitting on the office floor. His clothes were soaked. He had completely lost control of his body. Humiliation hit him almost as hard as the panic itself. A confident young professional had been reduced to a terrified man hiding in the corner of his own workplace. From that day forward, the attacks became more frequent. Doctors ran test after test but found nothing physically wrong. Specialists offered different explanations, but none of the treatments made any difference. His condition continued to deteriorate. Eventually, he lost his job. Friends gradually stopped answering his calls. Even leaving his apartment became impossible. Most days, Victor simply lay in bed, emotionally and physically exhausted, wondering how his life had unraveled so quickly. Some people believed he was suffering from a severe psychological disorder. Others whispered that someone had placed a curse on him. And considering what Victor had done 3 years earlier, it was becoming harder and harder to dismiss that possibility. If Victor's condition had a medical explanation, it never seemed to satisfy everyone. Some believed that fear itself could be a warning, a final attempt to protect someone from a danger they failed to recognize. Others claim that when fear appears without reason, it may be a sign that something beyond the ordinary has attached itself to a person's life. Psychologists, of course, offered a different perspective. They argued that overwhelming guilt and unresolved trauma can push the human mind into a state of regression. Under enough emotional pressure, even adults can unconsciously retreat to the emotional state of a frightened child. At the time, however, Victor wasn't thinking about psychology or curses. His thoughts kept drifting back to a memory he had spent years trying to bury. Back in college, Victor was the kind of guy everyone noticed. Confident, charming, and undeniably handsome, he never struggled to attract attention. Women were naturally drawn to him, and over time he began to believe there wasn't a single girl he couldn't win over if he really wanted to. One evening after classes, Victor and his friends gathered at their favorite bar. The drinks kept flowing, the jokes grew louder, and before long someone challenged Victor's oversized ego. The bet sounded simple. His friends would choose any girl they wanted. Victor had 1 month to make her fall in love with him, not just enough to date him. Enough to agree to marry him. If he succeeded, he would win the wager. If he failed, he'd owe every one of them a case of beer. At that exact moment, a young waitress approached their table with their drinks. Her name was Yulia. She attended the same university but lived a completely different life. Unlike most of the students, she came from a poor village family. She spent nearly every free hour studying or working to support herself. Quiet, hardworking, and incredibly kind, she rarely spoke to anyone unless she had to. Several of Victor's friends had tried asking her out before. Every one of them had been turned down. The moment they saw her, they knew she would be the perfect target. Victor accepted the challenge without hesitation. What he didn't know was that Yulia had secretly admired him for years. She never believed someone like Victor would even notice she existed. So when he suddenly started flirting with her, she immediately became suspicious. She knew his reputation, she had heard every story, and she refused to become just another name on his list. Her first answer was a firm no. For most people, rejection would have been the end of it. For Victor, it was only the beginning. Losing simply wasn't an option. He managed to get her phone number from one of the employees at the bar and began pursuing her relentlessly. Flowers appeared almost every week. Thoughtful gifts followed. He waited for her after work, invited her to dinner, and slowly convinced her that everything people said about him was wrong. Little by little, Yulia lowered her guard. 3 weeks later, Victor got down on one knee. He asked her to marry him. To Yulia, it felt like a dream. She couldn't believe that the most admired man at the university had chosen her. That weekend, she rushed home to tell her parents the incredible news. Her family was surprised by how quickly everything had happened, but one look at their daughter's face told them everything they needed to know. She was deeply in love. They immediately began preparing for the wedding. Relatives were invited. Plans were made. In the village, everyone expected the newlyweds to arrive after the ceremony for a proper celebration. While Yulia dreamed about her future, Victor celebrated something else entirely. That same evening, he met his friends at the bar and proudly announced that the wedding had been scheduled. He hadn't fallen in love. He hadn't found his soulmate. He had simply won the bet. A few days later, Victor and Yulia agreed to meet at a bridal salon to choose her wedding dress. Victor arrived late. Yulia had already found the one she loved. Smiling, she teased him from behind the fitting room curtain, telling him it was bad luck for a groom to see the bride before the wedding. Victor didn't smile back. Something about him felt different, cold, emotionless. He quietly told her the truth. There would be no wedding, there never had been. The engagement, the promises, the love, every bit of it had been nothing more than a game between friends. Only then did Yulia notice the group of people standing behind him. They weren't there to celebrate. They were laughing. She stood frozen in her wedding dress while the room spun around her. Everything she believed in collapsed within a matter of seconds. No one knows exactly how she left the salon that day, but after that, she disappeared. She never returned to her dormitory. She never answered another phone call. When the wedding day arrived, her parents waited for hours, convinced something terrible must have happened. Days turned into weeks. Weeks became months. Eventually, they reported her missing. No one could find her. Then, several years later, Yulia's mother received an unexpected phone call. An old family friend claimed she had seen a woman matching Yulia's description wandering around a railway station. Her parents rushed there immediately. What they found barely resembled the daughter they remembered. Yulia was alive, but after Victor publicly humiliated her, she had tried to take her own life by drinking industrial poison. Doctors managed to save her. The cost was devastating. Part of her stomach had been removed, leaving her permanently disabled. Ashamed and convinced she had nothing left to return home for, she had spent years drifting from place to place, surviving however she could. Victor didn't know any of this. The only thing he knew was that years later, by pure chance, he saw a homeless woman at a train station call his name. At first, he didn't recognize her. Then he looked closer. It was Yulia. Unable to face what he had done, Victor shoved her aside and walked away, pretending they had never met. But from that moment on, her face never left his mind, and before long, something far worse than guilt would come looking for him. When Yulia finally returned home, she told her family everything. She spoke about the humiliation in the bridal salon, about the poison she had swallowed after losing all hope, about the surgeries that saved her life but left her permanently disabled. Then she described the years that followed. The drinking, the nights spent sleeping at train stations, the endless struggle to survive, and finally, the day she saw Victor again. She had called out to him, hoping, if only for a moment, that he might recognize her. Instead, he looked her in the eyes and pretended she didn't exist. For Yulia's grandmother, that was the final straw. She had listened in silence, but inside, her anger grew with every word. As far as she was concerned, Victor had destroyed an innocent girl's life without ever facing the consequences. And that was something she could not accept. The elderly woman believed there was only one person who could restore the balance. An old fortune teller she had known for many years. Without telling anyone, she gathered the only things Yulia still had that connected her to Victor: a handkerchief he had once given her, and a photograph she had carried with her ever since they first met. She brought both items to the fortune teller. What happened during that visit was known only to the two women. But around the same time, Victor's life began to change. At first, the symptoms seemed insignificant. One evening, while sitting alone watching television, he felt a sharp pain deep in his abdomen. It disappeared almost as quickly as it came. He ignored it. Days later, an overwhelming feeling of fear appeared out of nowhere. Then another attack. And another. Within a single month, the confident young banker had become a prisoner of his own mind. Some believed it was nothing more than a severe psychiatric disorder. Others saw something entirely different. According to those who believed in the supernatural, Victor wasn't suffering from panic attacks at all. They believed someone had cursed him. Not out of jealousy, not for money, but for revenge. Whether you believe in curses or not, one thing is difficult to ignore. Victor never truly accepted responsibility for what he had done. And sooner or later, every action leaves a mark. Maybe guilt was finally catching up with him. Or maybe something far older and far darker had decided it was time to settle the score. Whatever the truth was, Victor would never be the same again. But his story isn't the only one. Sometimes, the desperate search for love can lead people down paths they never imagined taking. And once they cross that line, there's often no way back. Ludmila was 34 years old. For years, she had convinced herself she was over the man who broke her heart. His name was Roman. They had planned to get married until, without warning, he left her for another woman, a widow nearly 10 years older than him. People whispered that the widow had used love magic to steal him away. Ludmila dismissed the rumors. She was too proud to fight for someone who had betrayed her. Instead, she packed her belongings and moved to another city. Hopping distance would help her forget. It didn't. The years passed. Suitors came and went, but none of them ever felt right. Eventually, they stopped coming altogether. Loneliness slowly became part of her everyday life. Then one day, a new employee joined the company. His name was Boris. He worked in it. He was younger than Ludmila. Handsome, soft-spoken, and strangely enough, he looked almost identical to Roman. From the moment she saw him, old feelings she thought had died came rushing back. Determined to get closer, Ludmila began inventing excuses. Whenever Boris stepped outside for a cigarette, she suddenly found herself needing one too, even though she had barely smoked before. Whenever something went wrong with her computer, somehow it always seemed to happen during Boris's shift. Frozen screens, internet outages, printer failures, anything that would bring him into her office. Boris was always polite, always professional, but never flirtatious. He treated Ludmila exactly the same as everyone else. The more distant he remained, the more obsessed she became. Then the company announced its anniversary celebration. Ludmila saw it as the perfect opportunity. She spent an entire weekend preparing new clothes, a new hairstyle, professional makeup. When she looked in the mirror before leaving for the party, she barely recognized herself. For the first time in years, she felt beautiful. Throughout the evening, she searched the room for Boris. Eventually, she found him. He noticed her too. He smiled. For a brief moment, Ludmila thought fate was finally on her side. Then another woman walked over to Boris. Young, pretty. She slipped her arm around him and whispered something that made him laugh. Within minutes, Ludmila learned the truth. Boris was married. He and his wife had recently welcomed a baby daughter. She tried to let the fantasy go. She really did. She avoided calling Boris whenever her computer malfunctioned, asking another technician for help instead. But every night she dreamed about him. The dreams became so vivid that waking up felt like losing him all over again. In reality, Boris never gave her a reason to believe he shared her feelings. No matter what she tried, subtle flirting, lingering conversations, inviting him out for coffee, nothing worked. Still, she couldn't stop thinking about him. Eventually, desperation pushed her somewhere she never expected to go. Late one evening, while browsing online, she came across an article discussing ancient love rituals. Most of it sounded like nonsense, until one particular ritual caught her attention. A blood spell. According to the article, a single drop mixed into a drink could bind two people together forever. Ludmila had no idea whether any of it was real. But by that point, she was willing to believe almost anything. The next step was getting Boris into her apartment. So she deliberately sabotaged her own computer. When Boris arrived to fix it, she thanked him with a freshly brewed cup of coffee. He smiled, accepted the mug, and had no idea that someone else's plan had already begun. Legends surrounding blood-binding rituals have existed for centuries. According to folklore, the ritual requires a woman to mix a small amount of her own blood into a drink or meal while reciting a specific incantation. Those who believe in such practices claim it's one of the most powerful forms of love magic ever created, one that is incredibly difficult and sometimes even impossible to break. Whether any of those stories are true is impossible to say. Some insist it's nothing more than superstition. Others swear they've seen its effects with their own eyes. Ludmila wasn't interested in proving either side right. She only cared about one thing: making Boris fall in love with her. After intentionally damaging her computer, she invited Boris to her apartment under the pretense of fixing it. While he worked on the machine, she quietly prepared them both coffee. Only Ludmila knew what had been added to his cup. Boris smiled, thanked her, and took a sip. From that moment on, everything began to change. The transformation happened almost overnight. The very next day, Boris started looking for reasons to be around her. He invited her out for coffee, waited for her during cigarette breaks, walked her home after work. Within weeks, his attention became impossible to ignore. Flowers appeared at her desk. Unexpected gifts arrived without explanation. He called her constantly, searching for any excuse to hear her voice. A month later, Boris packed his belongings and moved into Ludmila's apartment, unable to imagine spending a single day away from her. At first, it felt like a fairy tale. Their relationship was passionate, intense, almost overwhelming. Ludmila believed she'd finally found the happiness she'd been searching for all her life. But dreams built on obsession rarely last. Before long, Boris's affection twisted into something much darker. He became possessive, suspicious, controlling. If Ludmila smiled at a coworker, he accused her of flirting. If she greeted a neighbor, he demanded to know why. Every conversation ended in an argument. Every argument fed his jealousy. Soon he was checking her phone, questioning where she'd been, and imagining betrayals that existed only in his own mind. Then the arguments became physical. When Boris eventually lost his job because of his increasingly unstable behavior, the situation spiraled even further. Now he spent entire days sitting alone in Ludmila's apartment, convincing himself she was cheating on him every time she went to work. Desperate, Ludmila ended the relationship and forced him to move out. But Boris refused to let go. He waited outside her apartment, followed her through the streets, showed up wherever she went. He pleaded. He threatened. He manipulated. Nothing she did could make him disappear. 3 years passed in constant fear. Eventually, Ludmila found herself back where it had all begun. Late at night, she searched the internet again. This time, she wasn't looking for a ritual to make someone fall in love. She was searching for a way to break whatever she had started. She tried every cleansing ritual, prayer, and supposed remedy she could find. None of them changed anything. Whether the ritual had truly possessed Boris, or whether guilt, obsession, and psychological dependence had consumed them both, the outcome was exactly the same. They were trapped. Then, when Ludmila had almost given up on ever finding peace, life surprised her. One evening, while driving through the city just to avoid going home, she offered a ride to a stranger. His name was Anatoly. He was a widower, raising a young daughter named Marina. Unlike Boris, Anatoly was calm, thoughtful, and gentle. There were no games, no manipulation, no desperate obsession. As they continued seeing each other, Ludmila grew close not only to him but also to Marina, who quickly became attached to her. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a future that felt normal. A peaceful home, a loving family, a second chance. But there was one problem. Boris was still there. He refused to disappear from her life. And every attempt to move forward only seemed to pull him back into it. Whether the ritual had truly worked, or whether everyone involved had become prisoners of their own choices, is something no one can say for certain. But stories like this all seem to end with the same warning. Love can be earned. It can grow. It can even survive impossible hardships. But the moment someone tries to force it, the consequences often become impossible to control.